December 5, 1945, 2:10 p.m., Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station in Florida, and Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a highly experienced pilot with 509 flight hours and combat experience in the Pacific Theater, leads Flight 19 into clear skies for what should be a routine navigation training exercise called Navigation Problem Number 1. And the 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers carrying 14 men in total are scheduled to fly east over the Atlantic practice bombing runs at a sunken target ship, continue east to the Bahamas, then turn north and finally west back to Fort Lauderdale in a simple triangular route that experienced pilots have flown dozens of times before. The weather is nearly perfect with unlimited ceiling and excellent visibility, and the aircraft are in pristine condition, having been meticulously maintained, and every pilot and crew member is trained and qualified, and there is absolutely no reason to expect anything other than a textbook training mission that will have everyone back on the ground in time for dinner. But at 3:45 p.m., just an hour and 35 minutes after takeoff, the radio tower at Fort Lauderdale receives a transmission from Lieutenant Taylor that makes the duty officer Zest's blood run cold, because Taylor reports that both of his compasses are malfunctioning and he cannot determine his position even though visibility is unlimited, and he should be able to see the Florida coastline or the Bahamas depending on where he is in the exercise. Over the next 3 hours and 19 minutes, the radio transmissions from Flight 19 become increasingly desperate and confused, with pilots reporting that the ocean doesn't look right and nothing looks the way it should, and they cannot determine which way is west, and multiple radio stations along the Florida coast pick up fragments of transmissions with pilots disagreeing about their location and discussing whether they are over the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Ocean or somewhere else entirely. At one point, Taylor is heard saying, "Both of my compasses are out and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." Even though investigators would later determine that Flight 19 was nowhere near the Florida Keys at any point during the flight, and the confusion in his voice is evident to everyone listening on the ground who realizes that something has gone terribly wrong. As daylight fades and weather conditions begin to deteriorate with a storm front moving in, the transmissions become more fragmented and panicked, with pilots reporting they cannot see anything and fuel is running low. And at 6:04 p.m., Taylor is heard transferring flight leadership to Captain George Stivers of Marine Squadron 73, suggesting that even the mission commander recognizes he is lost and disoriented beyond recovery. At 7:04 p.m., the final transmission is received, a faint broken message that cuts off mid-sentence and then silence. And Flight 19, with its 5 aircraft and 14 men, simply vanishes from the sky and the earth and every radar screen and radio frequency, as if the planes had flown into another dimension. And when a PBM Mariner flying boat designated Training 49 takes off from Banana River Naval Air Station at 7:27 p.m., with 13 men aboard to search for the missing flight, witnesses on the SS Gaines Mills report seeing an explosion in mid-air at approximately 7:50 p.m. at the exact time and location where Training 49 should have been flying. And now 6 aircraft and 27 men have disappeared in the span of 5 hours. Despite the most extensive air and sea search in naval history, covering 250,000 square miles of ocean and land, using 300 aircraft and dozens of ships over the course of 5 days, not a single piece of wreckage is found, not one body is recovered, not even an oil slick or floating debris field or life raft or anything that would indicate where 6 large military aircraft fell from the sky, and the complete absence of any physical evidence transforms a tragic accident into one of the most baffling mysteries in aviation history, because aircraft simply do not vanish without a trace, especially not 6 of them in perfect weather over well-traveled waters, with multiple radio stations listening and ships nearby and search planes dispatched within hours. The TBM Avenger torpedo bomber was one of the most reliable aircraft in the United States Navy's inventory in 1945, a rugged single-engine plane designed by Grumman specifically for carrier operations and proven in combat throughout the Pacific War. And each Avenger carried a crew of 3: a pilot, a turret gunner, and a radioman bombardier, making the total complement of Flight 19 15 men, including Lieutenant Taylor. These were not inexperienced pilots flying unfamiliar aircraft over unknown territory, but rather trained naval aviators conducting a routine exercise over waters they had flown many times before, and the navigation problem they were assigned was straightforward and simple. Fly east from Fort Lauderdale for 56 miles to Hen and Chicken Shoals, where they would practice bombing runs on a wrecked ship. Then continue east for another 67 miles, turn north and fly 73 miles, then turn west-southwest and fly approximately 120 miles back to Fort Lauderdale. The total distance was about 316 miles that should take approximately 2 hours. With fuel reserves sufficient for more than 6 hours of flight time, and the weather forecast showed favorable conditions with light winds and excellent visibility, and there were no reports of mechanical problems with any of the 5 aircraft during pre-flight inspections. Lieutenant Charles Taylor was 28 years old and had been flying since 1941 with extensive combat experience, including participation in strikes against Japanese-held islands. And though he had only recently transferred to Fort Lauderdale and was not deeply familiar with the Florida-Bahamas area, he had flown similar training missions before and was accompanied by 4 other pilots who knew the route well. The other pilots in Flight 19 included Captain Edward Joseph Powers, who was flying Avenger number FT-36, Marine Captain George William Stivers in FT-117 second, Lieutenant Forrest James Gerber in FT-81 and Captain Walter Reed Jeffrey in FT-87. And the 13 enlisted crew members were young men ranging in age from 18 to 27, and all of them boarded their aircraft that afternoon expecting a routine training flight that would be unremarkable in every way. None of them had any reason to believe they were about to become part of one of the most enduring mysteries in aviation history, and the area where they disappeared would soon become infamous as part of the Bermuda Triangle, a region of the Atlantic Ocean bounded roughly by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where ships and aircraft have allegedly vanished under mysterious circumstances for centuries. The flight took off at precisely 2:10 p.m., with Lieutenant Taylor in the lead aircraft, FT-28, and the 5 bombers lifted off from the runway in formation and headed east over the Atlantic Ocean on what the Navy called a navigation and combat training flight. And for the first hour and 35 minutes, everything proceeded exactly according to plan, with no radio communications suggesting any problems whatsoever. The first bombing runs at Hen and Chicken Shoals were completed successfully, and the flight continued eastward toward the second leg of their triangular route, and the weather remained excellent with visibility extending for miles in every direction. And there was nothing in the sky or sea that should have caused any concern to these experienced pilots. But at 3:45 p.m., Lieutenant Robert Cox, a senior flight instructor who was flying his own aircraft near Fort Lauderdale, heard a radio transmission from Taylor that immediately alarmed him because Taylor was asking the other pilots in his flight, "What is your compass reading?" As if he didn't trust his own instruments, and when Cox radioed to ask if Taylor needed assistance, the reply was shocking and inexplicable. Taylor reported that he didn't know where he was and that he believed his compasses were malfunctioning, and he stated that he was trying to find Fort Lauderdale but couldn't determine his position. And Cox attempted to guide Taylor back to base by instructing him to fly north toward Miami if he was lost, but Taylor responded that he didn't know which way was north and that everything below him looked wrong. The radio transmissions that followed over the next 3 hours paint a picture of increasing confusion and disorientation that defies logical explanation because the weather remained clear, visibility was unlimited, and the pilots should have been able to see landmarks or coastline or islands that would tell them exactly where they were. Yet every transmission suggests they were hopelessly lost in an area they should have known well. At 4:25 p.m., Taylor is heard telling his flight, "We may as well just turn around and go east again," even though flying east would take them farther out into the Atlantic Ocean and away from land, suggesting that Taylor believed they were over the Gulf of Mexico on the west side of Florida, when in fact they were east of Florida over the Atlantic, and this fundamental mistake in orientation should have been impossible for an experienced pilot to make in clear weather. Multiple radio stations picked up transmissions from the other pilots in Flight 19, expressing confusion and concern, with one pilot heard saying, "Damn it. If we could just fly west, we would get home. Head west, damn it." But Taylor overruled this suggestion and ordered the flight to continue north and then east, and other pilots were heard discussing whether they were over the Florida Keys or the Bahamas or somewhere else entirely, and the growing panic in their voices is evident even in the fragmentary recordings that survive. At 4:45 p.m. Taylor radioed, "We're not sure where we are. We think we must be 225 miles northeast of base," which would place them far out in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Bahamas, but radio triangulation by multiple stations suggested they were actually much closer to the Florida coast. And the fact that Taylor was so dramatically wrong about his position despite clear skies and functioning radios remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire incident. Port Everglades radio operators heard Taylor say, "Both my compasses are out and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I am in the Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." And the phrase, "the land is broken," is particularly strange because it suggests Taylor was seeing geographic features that didn't match his expectations or his understanding of the Florida Keys layout. As the afternoon wore on and fuel began to run low, the transmissions became more desperate, with pilots reporting they had enough fuel for only 75 more minutes of flight time. And Taylor was heard saying, "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together," indicating he had decided the entire flight would ditch in the ocean simultaneously, rather than having individual planes attempt to make it to shore. At 5:50 p.m., the Fort Lauderdale Tower received a transmission saying FTFT repeatedly, which was the call sign for Flight 19, followed by silence. And multiple attempts to re-establish radio contact failed, and by 6 p.m., with darkness falling and weather deteriorating rapidly as a cold front moved through the area, the situation had become dire. At 6:04 p.m., Taylor transferred command to Captain George Stivers, saying, "I'm turning it over to you. You take over and lead us," which suggests Taylor recognized he was lost beyond recovery and hoped another pilot might have better navigational awareness. And Stivers was heard acknowledging the transfer of command. But the transmissions remained confused and fragmented, with no clear indication that anyone in Flight 19 knew where they were or which direction would lead them to safety. The final transmission from Flight 19 was received at 7:04 p.m. A faint, garbled message that cut off abruptly. And after that moment, despite multiple radio stations listening on multiple frequencies, not another word was ever heard from any of the 5 aircraft or 15 men, and they simply vanished from the airwaves as if they had ceased to exist. The Navy immediately launched a rescue operation with a PBM Mariner flying boat designated Training 49 taking off from Banana River Naval Air Station at 7:27 p.m. with a crew of 13 men aboard, and the Mariner was a large patrol bomber designed for long-range search and rescue operations, and it should have been able to search a wide area and spot any survivors or wreckage in the water. But at approximately 7:50 p.m., witnesses aboard the SS Gaines Mills, a tanker ship that was sailing in the area where Training 49 should have been conducting its search, reported seeing a massive explosion in mid-air, followed by flames that burned briefly on the ocean surface before disappearing. And when investigators later interviewed the crew of the Gaines Mills, they consistently described seeing an aircraft explode and fall into the sea at the exact time and location where Training 49 was flying. The PBM Mariner was known to be prone to fuel vapor leaks and was nicknamed the flying gas tank by its crews because of its tendency to develop explosive fuel fumes. And it's widely believed that Training 49 suffered a catastrophic fuel explosion that killed all 13 men aboard instantly. But even this seemingly straightforward explanation is complicated by the fact that no wreckage from the Mariner was ever recovered, despite intensive searches of the area where the Gaines Mills reported seeing the explosion. And so within 5 hours, 6 aircraft and 27 men had disappeared, Flight 19's 5 Avengers with 15 men vanishing without a trace, and Training 49's Mariner with 13 men apparently exploding in midair but leaving no recoverable wreckage. And the Navy found itself facing the largest peacetime loss of aircraft and personnel in its history, with no bodies to recover, no wreckage to examine, and no clear explanation for what had happened. The search operation that followed was staggering in its scope and intensity, involving more than 300 aircraft, including Navy patrol bombers, Coast Guard planes, and Army Air Force search aircraft, along with dozens of Navy ships, Coast Guard cutters, and civilian vessels volunteering to help. And the search area covered 250 square miles of ocean and land, extending from the Florida coast east to the Bahamas and north almost to Jacksonville, and search crews flew day and night for 5 days, examining every square mile of ocean surface and coastline, looking for any sign of wreckage or survivors or bodies. Aircraft flew low over the water in careful grid patterns, searching for oil slicks or debris fields or floating wreckage, and ships crisscrossed the search area, looking for anything unusual. And coastal patrols walked miles of Florida beaches and Bahamas shorelines, looking for any evidence that might have washed ashore. And the search continued until December 10th, when the Navy reluctantly called it off after finding absolutely nothing. No life rafts, no pieces of aircraft, no floating debris, no oil slicks, no bodies, no personal effects, nothing whatsoever to indicate where 6 large military aircraft had fallen from the sky. The complete absence of any physical evidence was and remains the most baffling aspect of the entire mystery. Because aircraft simply do not disappear without leaving some trace, especially not 6 aircraft that collectively weighed more than 60,000 pounds and contained thousands of pieces of equipment and personal belongings that should have floated or washed ashore, even if the aircraft themselves sank, and the fact that the most intensive search in naval history found absolutely nothing suggests either that the aircraft came down in a location far from where searchers looked, or that something highly unusual prevented normal wreckage patterns from occurring. The official Navy Inquiry Board convened on December 7, 1945, just 2 days after the disappearance, and over the following weeks investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, including radio operators who heard the transmissions, base personnel who prepared the aircraft, other pilots who were flying in the area that day, and the crew of the SS Gaines Mills who saw Training 49 explode, and the board examined weather records, aircraft maintenance logs, fuel consumption calculations, radio transcripts, and every other piece of evidence they could gather in an attempt to understand what had happened to Flight 19. The initial findings of the inquiry were straightforward and damning, with the board concluding that Lieutenant Taylor became disoriented and confused due to his lack of familiarity with the Florida Bahamas area, that his compass did malfunction, or that he misread it, that he led the flight in the wrong direction, based on his mistaken belief that they were over the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Atlantic Ocean, that he ignored advice from other pilots and ground stations that might have saved them, and that he ultimately caused the loss of 5 aircraft and 15 men through poor judgment and navigational errors, and the board's report placed primary blame on Taylor for the disaster. But Taylor's mother was outraged by this conclusion and fought vigorously to have her son's name cleared, arguing that he was an experienced combat veteran who would not have made such elementary navigational mistakes, and she pointed out that all 5 aircraft suffered compass problems simultaneously, which suggested something environmental rather than pilot error. And she challenged the Navy to explain why multiple experienced pilots with functioning radios and clear weather couldn't find their way back to Florida from a relatively short distance offshore, and her persistence eventually forced the Navy to reopen the inquiry. The revised findings, issued in 1946, were dramatically different, with the board removing any specific blame from Lieutenant Taylor and instead concluding that the loss of Flight 19 was due to causes or reasons unknown, which is perhaps the most honest but least satisfying conclusion ever reached by a military investigation. And this phrase, causes or reasons unknown, would become infamous as the Navy's admission that they simply could not explain what had happened despite extensive investigation. The mystery deepened in the following years as various theories emerged to explain the disappearance, with the most conventional explanation being that Taylor became disoriented, flew the flight northeast out into the Atlantic Ocean, believing they were going west, and that when fuel ran out, all 5 aircraft ditched in rough seas and sank quickly in deep water beyond the range of where searchers looked. And this theory is supported by the radio transmissions showing Taylor's confusion and by basic fuel calculations that suggest the aircraft would have run out of fuel somewhere in the deep Atlantic if they flew northeast, as the transmissions suggest. But this conventional explanation struggles to answer several troubling questions, including why Taylor became so completely disoriented in perfect weather when he should have been able to see the sun setting in the west and determine basic directions, why all 5 compasses apparently malfunctioned simultaneously, as multiple pilots reported, why the other experienced pilots in the flight didn't override Taylor's commands and fly west to safety when they realized he was lost, and most critically why no wreckage was ever found despite searches covering a massive area including the deep Atlantic where the aircraft presumably went down. The compass failure is particularly puzzling because the TBM Avenger had 2 independent compass systems, a magnetic compass and a gyroscopic compass, and the likelihood of both systems failing on all 5 aircraft simultaneously is astronomically small. And some investigators have suggested that the flight encountered some kind of magnetic anomaly or unusual atmospheric condition that disrupted the compasses, but no such condition was ever documented in the area, and weather records show nothing unusual for December 5, 1945. Alternative theories have proposed various environmental explanations, including rogue waves that could have swallowed the aircraft without leaving debris, underwater methane eruptions that could have caused the planes to lose buoyancy and sink rapidly, or unusual electromagnetic phenomena that could have disrupted the compasses and disoriented the pilots. And while all of these phenomena are scientifically possible, there is no evidence that any of them occurred in the area on that specific day, and they fail to explain why the massive search found no trace of 6 aircraft. The disappearance of Flight 19 became the foundational myth of the Bermuda Triangle legend when writers and researchers in the 1960s and 1970s began documenting mysterious disappearances in the region, and the story was featured prominently in books and documentaries that claimed the area possessed supernatural or extraterrestrial properties that caused ships and aircraft to vanish. And Flight 19 was held up as the ultimate example of the triangle, yes, deadly mystery, because the disappearance seemed to defy rational explanation and involved experienced military personnel using reliable equipment in good weather. But serious researchers have challenged many aspects of the Bermuda Triangle mythology, pointing out that the area is one of the busiest shipping and aviation corridors in the world, and that the number of disappearances is statistically consistent with the volume of traffic. And they note that many of the disappearances attributed to the triangle have conventional explanations involving bad weather, mechanical failures, human error, or inadequate search efforts, and they argue that the triangle's reputation is built more on sensationalism and selective reporting than on genuine scientific mystery. However, Flight 19 remains difficult to explain even for skeptics who dismiss the broader Bermuda Triangle legend, because the specific circumstances, multiple aircraft with multiple experienced pilots reporting compass failures in clear weather over familiar waters, followed by complete disappearance without any wreckage despite immediate extensive search efforts, genuinely do constitute an unusual cluster of factors that resist easy explanation. And even the Navy's own investigation concluded that the cause remained unknown rather than identifying a clear mechanical or human error that explained the loss. Recent investigations using modern technology have attempted to locate the wreckage of Flight 19, with several underwater search efforts exploring the seafloor east of Florida using sonar and submersibles. And in 1991, a salvage company claimed to have found five Avengers in the exact formation that Flight 19 would have been flying, sitting on the seafloor 600 feet deep off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. But when the aircraft were examined, their serial numbers did not match Flight 19, and they turned out to be training aircraft that had been deliberately ditched in the 1940s as part of other exercises. Other expeditions have found individual Avenger wrecks in various locations around Florida and the Bahamas, and each time the discovery generates excitement that Flight 19 might finally be found. But in every case, so far the aircraft have been identified as other planes that crashed in other incidents, and the 5 Avengers of Flight 19 with their specific serial numbers remain missing, and the Atlantic Ocean has kept their location secret for nearly 80 years. The question of what happened to Lieutenant Taylor and his compass continues to haunt the mystery, with some researchers suggesting he may have suffered from spatial disorientation, a condition where pilots lose track of their position and orientation relative to the Earth due to conflicting sensory inputs, and spatial disorientation can cause experienced pilots to make catastrophic navigational errors because their internal sense of direction conflicts with their instruments. But this typically occurs in poor visibility or instrument conditions, not in clear weather with unlimited visibility as existed on December 5th. Others have pointed to Taylor's combat experience as potentially relevant, noting that he had been shot down twice in the Pacific and may have carried psychological scars that affected his judgment under stress. And some have suggested he may have been suffering from the aftereffects of malaria, which he contracted during the war. And while none of this explains why his compasses failed or why he became so completely disoriented, it might explain why he made poor decisions once the problems began. The fate of the other pilots and crew members is equally troubling because radio transcripts show that some of them recognized Taylor was leading them in the wrong direction and wanted to fly west, but they ultimately followed his orders and stayed in formation. And this raises questions about military discipline and chain of command, and whether the other pilots should have broken formation and struck out on their own when it became clear Taylor was hopelessly lost. But breaking formation in military aviation goes against every training instinct, and the pilots of Flight 19 stayed together until the end. The families of the lost men spent decades searching for answers, with some never accepting the official conclusion that their loved ones simply flew out to sea and drowned, And some family members have continued to investigate the mystery and search for new evidence, and occasional reports of Avenger wrecks or debris continue to surface, but none have been conclusively linked to Flight 19. And for most of the families, the lack of closure, no bodies recovered, no wreckage found, no final answers, has been the hardest aspect of the tragedy to bear. And so the mystery of Flight 19 endures nearly 80 years later as one of aviation's most baffling unsolved cases, with 5 aircraft and 15 men disappearing in clear weather over familiar waters despite functioning radios and immediate search efforts, and the rescue aircraft exploding in mid-air, adding 13 more victims to the tragedy, and the complete absence of any recoverable wreckage from 6 large military aircraft, defying everything we know about how aircraft crashes work and what evidence they leave behind, and the Navy's final conclusion that the cause remains unknown, standing as an admission that sometimes mysteries defy explanation, no matter how thoroughly we investigate them. The various theories, pilot disorientation, compass malfunction, magnetic anomalies, environmental phenomena, navigation errors, fuel exhaustion, all have elements that make sense and elements that fail to satisfy. And no single explanation accounts for all the evidence and all the strange details. And perhaps the truth is some combination of factors that created a perfect storm of confusion and tragedy. Or perhaps there is something about that day and that place that we still don't understand. What remains is a genuine mystery that has resisted 80 years of investigation, speculation, and search efforts, and the question of where Flight 19 went and why it could not find its way home continues to haunt anyone who studies the case. And somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, or perhaps closer to shore than anyone has yet searched, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers rest on the seafloor with 15 men still inside them, and the ocean keeps their final secret. And we are left to wonder what Lieutenant Charles Taylor saw that made him say, "The ocean doesn't look right," and "Nothing looks the way it should." And what caused experienced pilots with functioning aircraft and clear skies to become so hopelessly lost that they flew to their deaths believing they were somewhere they were not. And until the wreckage is found and examined, until we have physical evidence to analyze, the mystery of Flight 19 will remain one of those rare cases where the questions outnumber the answers, and where the best explanation we have is simply that we don't know what happened, and that uncertainty is perhaps the most unsettling mystery of all.